I never imagined a simple gate could ignite a neighborhood war. But the night I heard the HOA pounding on my door, I knew they'd crossed a line. They claimed I was blocking community access, but this wasn't about safety. It was about control. Fines started piling up. Letters turned threatening. Neighbors I'd waved to for years suddenly treated me like an enemy. And then came the ultimatum: unlock that gate, or else. What they didn't know was that I'd already set a plan in motion, one that would change every driveway on the street forever. Would you fight back or cave in? When my wife and I first drove through Maple Hollow Estates, it looked like the kind of quiet suburb we'd dreamed about for years. Tree-lined streets curled into soft cul-de-sacs. Kids pedaled bikes across perfectly smooth pavement. Porch lights glowed warm and steady after sunset, like a row of friendly beacons. It felt safe, predictable, everything we wanted after a decade of noisy city apartments. We bought a modest brick home at the end of a private lane that dead-ended against a stretch of woods. Our backyard opened onto tall pines and the distant hum of crickets, a sound that instantly became our favorite part of the evening. Neighbors waved when we moved in. The HOA board president, a silver-haired retiree named Carol, even brought over a plate of brownies. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said with a smile that at the time felt genuine. Life settled quickly into a peaceful rhythm. Early morning jogs down the shaded streets. Weekend barbecues with the couple next door. We built a small garden behind the house and installed a simple wooden gate across the narrow driveway. Just enough to keep stray dogs from wandering in and to give us a sense of privacy. It was the kind of quiet, private comfort we'd always pictured when we talked about home. But little things began to shift. Carol's friendly waves turned into tight-lipped nods. A few board members started leaving neatly folded flyers on our porch, reminders about community uniformity and driveway accessibility. At first, I thought they were just routine notices. After all, every neighborhood has a few quirky rules. Then one evening, I noticed a man I didn't recognize standing at the edge of our driveway, clipboard in hand, studying the closed gate as if it were a crime scene. He didn't speak, just scribbled something, took a photo, and walked off without a word. The next morning, a formal letter from the HOA appeared in our mailbox. It was polite, almost cheerful, but the message was clear. Remove the gate immediately to maintain neighborhood access and visual consistency. That's when I felt the first quiet spark of unease, because that gate wasn't just a piece of wood on hinges. It was ours, on land we maintained, on a driveway we paid for. And in that moment, I sensed that this wasn't really about a gate at all. Would you give in to keep the peace, or hold your ground when the rules stopped making sense? The first notice of violation came tucked inside a crisp white envelope. No stamp, just the HOA's logo in deep green across the top. Violation: non-compliant barrier obstructing community easement. Corrective action required within 10 days. Failure to comply may result in daily fines. I stared at it, baffled. Our driveway wasn't a community easement. It was part of our deed. Still, I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was a mistake. I emailed the HOA office with a copy of our property survey attached, pointing out the clear boundary line. 2 days later, a second letter arrived, this time with a red urgent stamp and a $150 administrative fee added to our account. That was when the unease hardened into anger. I called the board president, Carol, expecting a reasonable conversation. Instead, she answered with a brittle cheerfulness that barely hid her irritation. "The gate blocks emergency access," she said. "It's against the aesthetic guidelines." "Our driveway isn't a fire lane," I replied, keeping my voice even. "And there's no mention of gates in the guidelines," Carol sighed. "Those guidelines are subject to board interpretation." Interpretation. That single word told me everything. The rules were whatever they decided, whenever they decided it. Within a week, the fines doubled. A compliance officer I'd never met began walking past the house each morning, camera phone raised, snapping pictures of our gate, our yard, even our parked car. One afternoon, I caught him leaning over the fence with a tape measure, as if the gate's height might somehow condemn us. When I confronted him, he only smirked. "Just doing my job," The neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. Rumors spread that we were troublemakers, that we were endangering the neighborhood's property values. The tension thickened like a summer storm cloud. Then came the late-night knocks. It started at 11:47 p.m., 3 sharp raps on the door. When I opened it, no one was there. The next night, the same thing. On the third night, I caught a shadow slipping behind a hedge but couldn't make out a face. Each morning afterward, a fresh notice of violation waited on the porch. The fines now totaled nearly $1,000. I began documenting everything. Photos, timestamps, copies of every letter. My wife kept a log of the nightly disturbances. We filed a complaint with the county only to learn the HOA operated in a legal gray zone, shielded by their own bylaws. The board escalated further. They filed a lien against our property without a single court hearing, claiming unpaid community maintenance fees tied to the gate dispute. A lien meant if we ever tried to sell, they could force payment or block the sale entirely. It was a move meant to break us, to scare us into submission, but fear gave way to determination. I dug deeper into the HOA's records. Buried in county archives, I discovered something they clearly hoped no one would notice. The stretch of private road leading from the main street to our cul-de-sac wasn't actually owned by the HOA. Decades ago, the developer had sold that strip to a defunct construction company. No one had claimed it since, which meant, astonishingly, that the HOA's beloved access road was legally abandoned. I filed a quiet inquiry with the county clerk. For a modest fee and a bit of paperwork, I could purchase that forgotten road outright. It felt almost too good to be true, but the more I confirmed the details, the clearer it became. The HOA had no legal standing over that road, or over my gate. I didn't tell a soul. Not yet. Meanwhile, the harassment intensified. One Saturday morning, we woke to find our mailbox smashed, its metal bent like a crushed can. No witnesses, no fingerprints. When I reported it, the HOA's only response was a friendly reminder that residents were responsible for keeping mailboxes aesthetically uniform. Days later, a bright orange tow notice appeared on my wife's car, parked squarely in our own driveway. It was psychological warfare, waged with paper notices and thinly veiled threats. But each petty act only fueled my resolve. I gathered every scrap of evidence, photos of the smashed mailbox, recordings of the late-night knocks, and a detailed ledger of every unjust fee. At the same time, I worked quietly with a real estate attorney to finalize the purchase of that forgotten stretch of road. The moment the deed recorded in my name, a surge of grim satisfaction coursed through me. The HOA thought they controlled access to our property. Now I controlled access to theirs. Still, I kept my plan hidden. Let them think they were winning. I continued to pay our standard HOA dues to avoid suspicion, all while their fines piled higher. When the next final warning arrived, threatening foreclosure if we didn't remove the gate within 30 days, I almost laughed. They were threatening us for a road they no longer legally had the right to drive on. I waited until the deed paperwork cleared and the county updated the records. Only then did I draft a letter of my own. It wasn't angry. It was brief, almost polite. Effective immediately, the private access road leading to Maple Hollow Estates is under new ownership. Continued use without permission constitutes trespassing. Please govern yourselves accordingly. I attached a certified copy of the deed. Then I sat back and waited for the storm I knew was coming. What followed would turn every smug smile at the HOA meetings into stunned silence, and prove that the quietest homeowner on the block could fight back harder than they ever imagined. Would they dare challenge a legal owner? Or would the community finally see who had really crossed the line? The answer would leave the entire neighborhood reeling. The HOA meeting that night felt more like a courtroom than a community gathering. The clubhouse's fluorescent lights flickered against a tense silence as I walked in, a folder of documents under my arm. Rows of metal chairs creaked as neighbors turned to watch me, their expressions a mix of curiosity and thinly disguised hostility. Carol sat at the head of the long conference table, her silver hair perfectly arranged, gavel poised like a weapon. Beside her were the other board members, all stiff shoulders and tight smiles. A single empty chair waited across from them as if I were a defendant called to stand trial. "Mr. Hayes," Carol began, her voice carrying that brittle sweetness I'd come to know too well. "We're here to resolve your continuing violations. I trust you've come prepared to remove the gate and settle your outstanding fines." The room hummed with a low murmur of expectation. I set the thick folder on the table and met her gaze. "Actually, I came to discuss something far more important." Carol's eyebrows arched in feigned patience. "And what might that be?" I slid a certified deed across the polished surface. "The road," I said evenly. "I now own the private access road leading into Maple Hollow Estates." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the room erupted. Chairs scraped, voices rose in disbelief. One of the board members snatched up the document, scanning it with frantic eyes. This isn't possible," Carol sputtered, her composure cracking. "That road belongs to the association." "Actually," I said, pulling out a second sheet, the county's property record, "it belonged to a defunct construction company. Abandoned for decades, and as of 3 weeks ago it belongs to me." The murmurs swelled into outright chaos. Neighbors whispered in sharp, urgent tones. Someone gasped audibly. Carol's knuckles whitened around the gavel. "You can't just take a road," she snapped, the sweetness gone. "I didn't take anything," I replied, keeping my voice calm but firm. "I purchased it, legally, recorded, stamped, and notarized by the county clerk." "The HOA has no right-of-way without my consent?" Carol's face flushed a deep crimson as she tried to regain control. "This is outrageous. You are deliberately obstructing community access and threatening public safety. We will call the sheriff." "We will—" "You've already called them," I interrupted, sliding another document across the table, a letter from the county sheriff's office. "They've reviewed the deed. It's private property. They have no jurisdiction to force access without my permission." A hush fell over the room. The board members looked at one another, their bravado slipping into panic. Carol tried again, her voice rising, brittle with desperation. "This is extortion. You can't hold an entire neighborhood hostage." I leaned forward, my words measured but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "I don't want to hold anyone hostage. I want the harassment to stop. The fines, the late-night knocks, the threats. Stop them, and we'll discuss an easement agreement. But if this continues, I can legally restrict all vehicle access. Every car, every delivery truck, every emergency vehicle will need my written approval." Gasps rippled through the room. A man in the back muttered, "He's got us!" Carol slammed the gavel so hard the sound echoed like a gunshot. "This meeting is adjourned," she barked, but no one moved. Neighbors began questioning her, voices overlapping in growing outrage. "Is this true, Carol? Didn't you check the property records? Why are we paying dues if we don't even own the road?" Carol stood trembling, her carefully constructed authority collapsing under the weight of her neighbor's anger. I remained seated, watching the board unravel. That night marked the peak of their campaign against us and its spectacular collapse. Yet the battle wasn't over. The next morning, a formal email arrived from the HOA attorney, thick with legal jargon and thinly veiled threats. But attached to it was an offer. The board proposes an immediate cessation of fines and a formal apology in exchange for an access easement. It was the clearest admission of defeat they could muster. Could have ended it there, signed an easement, let life return to normal. But I wasn't done. For weeks, they'd treated us like trespassers in our own home, wielding their power like a weapon. They'd filed a lien, smashed our mailbox, and turned neighbors into spies. They needed to understand that there were consequences for every sleepless night they'd caused. So instead of replying, I waited. Days later, panic spread through the neighborhood. Trash pickup was suddenly delayed. Delivery drivers called residents, confused about whether they were allowed past the new private road, no trespassing sign I'd posted at the entrance. The HOA scrambled to calm everyone, but without a signed easement, they had no legal standing to promise access. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now knocked on my door, not with threats, but with quiet requests. "Please," one elderly couple pleaded, "we just want to get to work without worrying." I assured them they had nothing to fear. The sign wasn't a blockade. It was a message to the board, but the shift in power was unmistakable. Finally, Carol herself appeared on my porch, the same woman who once smiled through a plate of brownies. Gone was the condescending confidence. She looked smaller, her voice softer. "We need to talk," she said. I stepped outside, folding my arms. "About what?" Her eyes flicked to the gate, still closed, still mine. "About making this right." For the first time, she didn't dictate terms. She asked. We met again at the clubhouse, but this time the room felt entirely different. No gavel, no stiff formality. Just Carol, a few board members, and a folder of revised bylaws. She spoke carefully, each word weighed like fragile glass. "The board will rescind all fines, remove the lien, and issue a public apology. We'd also like to negotiate a fair maintenance agreement for the road. You will retain full ownership, of course." I listened, letting the silence stretch. Finally, I nodded once. "That's a start." The relief in the room was palpable. Walking home that night, the air felt lighter. The street lamps glowed a little warmer. For the first time in months, I heard the sound of crickets without a knot of tension in my chest. The HOA's reign of petty intimidation had ended, not with a quiet compromise, but with a deed, a plan, and an unshakable resolve. I paused at the gate, running a hand across the wood they'd tried so hard to tear down. They wanted me to unlock it. Instead, I'd locked in something far stronger. My right to live in peace on the land I owned, and as the neighborhood slowly realized who really controlled the road beneath their tires. One thought echoed like a promise in the cool night air. This fight isn't over until I say it is. The next chapter, the long-term impact on the neighborhood, and the lesson every homeowner can take from it would prove just as unforgettable. The morning after the second clubhouse meeting, I opened my front door to find the street oddly quiet. No early joggers, no dog walkers. Even the usual rustle of car engines heading to work seemed to pause. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. A single envelope rested on the welcome mat. This one bore no threats, no urgent stamps, just my name written in careful, almost apologetic handwriting. Inside was a brief letter on HOA letterhead, effective immediately. The Board of Maple Hollow Estates rescinds all fines, removes the lien on your property, and offers its formal apology for any distress caused. We request a meeting at your convenience to discuss a voluntary maintenance arrangement for the private road under your ownership. No demands, no ultimatums, just a concession they'd never imagined making a few short weeks before. Word of the deed and the board's quiet capitulation spread faster than a summer storm. By dusk, neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months began stopping by. Some came with tentative smiles, others with awkward half-apologies. "I didn't know they were going that far," murmured a man from 2 houses down. "I figured it was just a small dispute about a gate." A young couple admitted the board had warned them to keep their distance from us or risk fines of their own. "We're sorry," they said, their voices low but earnest. For the first time, I realized how much fear the HOA had sown across the community. People had stayed silent not out of malice, but out of quiet dread of becoming the next target. But now, the spell was broken. Within weeks, a grassroots group of homeowners formed, demanding greater transparency. Meetings that once drew a handful of obedient attendees now filled the clubhouse to capacity. Neighbors who'd never questioned the board began scrutinizing every bylaw, every budget line, every vote. The board, once smug and untouchable, suddenly found itself under a microscope. Carol remained president in name, but the authority she'd wielded